Hello, and welcome everyone to our Vistatec Life Sciences in Focus podcast. Fascinating conversations with global life sciences experts. This is a space where we interview life sciences experts once a month, and I'm your host, Maria Mateos. And today I'm joined by Dr. Simran Padam. Her work sits at the intersection of medicine, clinical research, and drug development. And what I find particularly interesting about Dr. Padam's perspective is that she doesn't look at clinical trials simply as protocols that need to be followed. She sees the much bigger picture, I want to say, the clinical judgments, the operational decisions, patient realities, and scientific uncertainty that ultimately determine whether a promising therapy can successfully make its way through development. So we're going to explore what really happens behind the scenes of drug development and particularly oncology, and why some of these important decisions in clinical research can't always be found in a protocol. So, welcome, Dr. Padam. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure our audience would love to hear about everything. But before we get into science and trials, I'd love to hear about your own journey. Basically, what initially drew you towards clinical research and drug development, and what was that particular experience that made you realize, well, this is the field I want to be in?
Of course. So, my path into clinical research and drug development wasn't something that I planned from the beginning. Just like every other physician, I thought about medicine as a traditional route. You go through your rotations, you go through, take your board exams, go through residency, and then, you go into clinical practice. And I thought about medicine as seeing one patient at a time. But during my rotations, even though my focus was really the patient in front of me, I started questioning about what happens when these patients run out of these standard of care treatment options, like what's next for them. And, luckily I had amazing mentors in my career early on, and they suggested that I look into clinical research. And once I transitioned into clinical research, I became more involved with, what was happening behind the scenes. And I really started seeing another side of medicine that I found fascinating. I started really understanding what was happening before a new therapy ever reaches, clinical practice. And I think what really drew me into clinical research was realizing the scale of impact you can make. You're helping develop drugs that could potentially treat hundreds to thousands of patients in the future. And that idea was very meaningful to me, and it really resonated with me. And so after, working in oncology, this even made it more meaningful because the field changes so quickly. You can watch an idea move from laboratory to clinical trials and eventually become treatment that, changes patient care. And you're also working with patients that have a lot of significant unmet medical needs, so that makes the work even more meaningful. So technically, I wouldn't really say there was one dramatic moment where I suddenly realized that this is what I'm going to do. I think it was more of a gradual realization that, a lot of things came together that I really enjoyed. And almost after 2 decades in oncology clinical research and drug development, I'm still excited because there's always something new to learn. And, and sometimes a single patient will teach you so much more about a clinical trial that you never anticipated. And so I think this is what like kind of drew me into clinical research, what kept me in research, and so kind of my journey here.
Yeah, and you said something that really resonated with me as well. It's you never thought about clinical trials until you got it in front of you. And I think it's similar to the path many people in clinical research follows. Like, I don't think anyone gets into med school thinking, I want to work on clinical trials. But once it's in front of you, you are drawn into it and there's no way back.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And I don't think it's really taught in med school, so that's kind of unfortunate. I think you learn it from, talking to other people, connecting with other people, having great mentors. So that's the downside that it isn't really taught in med school. But yeah.
Well, I guess you were lucky to have those amazing mentors in your life. And you've spent a lot of time thinking about the gap between what we plan on paper and what actually happens when a trial meets the real patient. So I'm wondering, looking back, is there any one single lesson in your career that changed the way you think about clinical trials or decision making?
I think as you gain years of experience, you start realizing that the protocol is just a framework for a trial. It's never the complete, I guess, handbook when you're conducting a trial or overseeing a trial, and it can never replace clinical judgment. And I think I've learned that over the years because when I started in the career, I thought protocols would provide all the answers that, came in. It would provide you direction. It would provide you, your pathway, your escalation pathways, for example. But protocols, are so intentionally structured. We define eligibility criteria, dose modification rules, and, like laboratory thresholds. And we need the structure because obviously clinical research has to be consistent, but when you transfer these protocols into real world situations, patients don't fit neatly into these definitions. So, for example, especially dealing with patients with advanced cancer, these patients are on several prior lines of therapy. They have multiple comorbidities, or they're on 10 different con medications. And then something happens to them. They may have elevated liver enzymes. You really have to determine what happens next and what that actually means. Is it related to the drug that you're testing? Is it related to disease progression or, the 10 other medications that they're taking on the side? So I think I've learned that the protocol really can't anticipate every possible combination or scenario in a clinical trial, and that's where medical judgment really comes in and becomes so important. Um, and I think, another important lesson that I've learned is we work in such a very like a heavy data industry, right? We're looking at tables, listings, adverse events, laboratory trends, but we have to remember that there's a story behind all this data. And I think we have to remember that there's patients behind this data. So when you're looking at this data, that's something you have to keep in mind because that's the information that could tell you about a patient's clinical story. So I think those are the two important lessons that I've learned over the years working in clinical research, and they've helped me as well. So
Yeah, and it's so important to remember that. I am trying to remember your words, like the protocol is the structure, and then you
yeah,
need to fill those gaps with people's lives. I mean, those lives that are there playing some role in the study, which is the crucial role, right? Yeah, and I'm thinking about my next question to you as you were speaking, because we often think of the medical monitor primarily as someone responsible for reviewing safety and making sure a trial stays appropriate, medically appropriate. Um, and you described the role as having evolved far beyond uh, safety review. So, how has the medical monitor role changed in these last years? And how can that person actually influence clinical strategy, decisions, and ultimately the execution of the trial?
yeah, and this is very interesting because I feel like this is still misunderstood about what a medical monitor does. And when you talk to people in clinical research in the industry, people really think of medical monitors as, like you said, physicians who kind of review safety data, right? They're called in when there's an SAE or when there's an eligibility question or a, complicated case to discuss, for example. And yeah, those are very important parts of the role, and patient safety is the fundamental part of the role. But I think the modern medical monitor contributes much more broadly, right? We sit at such a unique position because we're sitting in the middle of the patient, the investigator, the site, the protocol. and the emerging clinical data. And so this gives us visibility that everyone doesn't really see. I think what I like to say is we're at the core or the center of a clinical trial. So, for example, we get to see trends. So imagine, one site, and this has happened to me in the past, when a site asks me an eligibility question, I'll answer it. Then I have another site asking me a very similar question. And then three more sites are asking me essentially the same question. So at some point, I really need to stop treating these as five separate questions that are coming in and really start looking at a pattern here. Well, why does this question keep coming up? Maybe the protocol language isn't clear. Maybe the eligibility criteria is too restrictive, or maybe the site training wasn't adequate. So I think now I've moved from being, a medical monitor that's just looking at patient safety, like answering an eligibility question, to someone that's identifying a study level problem. And I think this is where we come in with that becomes a strategy, right? We're not reviewing one adverse at a time or one eligibility question at a time. We're really trying to look at patterns across patients, across sites. And I think that's where medical monitoring starts contributing to the strategy of the study. And like you said, we can influence operation decisions because imagine if enrollment is slow. The immediate action would be for everyone to say, oh, add more sites. Yeah, maybe, but if that's occurring with me and I'm dealing with that situation, I'd really think about, okay, well, before adding sites, I really want to understand why the enrollment is slow. So then I start asking, are patients failing screening because of an eligibility criterion, or is the study too burdensome for them? Or are investigators seeing the right patients? So that all these are operational problems, but they have that medical component where I can come in and help and assist with that, right? So I think that's why, especially the best medical monitors that I've worked with, they can move between two perspectives. They can move between the individual patient perspective and the overall development program. And so I think that's really important. So I think that's how the role is evolving beyond just safety review. We're becoming more involved in the actual study level program, where the decisions are being made. So I think that's very important. And that's what you'll see most experienced medical monitors kind of doing as a day-to-day job besides their safety data reviews.
Yeah, it's a more holistic approach, like an
Yeah.
umbrella approach, and finding those individual root causes to the repeated questions might lead you to think, okay, as you said, there's something missing in this protocol, and that opens the door to more patients
Yeah, exactly.
that may be
Exactly.
failing the screening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. That's a fantastic change in my mind. Um, and moving into specific questions about, for example, phase one and first in human oncology studies, these are often portrayed as highly structured, protocol driven. Um, but based on what we've been talking, once you are actually treating patients, things can become much more complex. So what are some of the things that happen in early phase oncology trials that are protocols where a protocol cannot simply anticipate and where clinical judgment becomes particularly important?
Yeah, yeah. And like you said, I think phase one is a clear example of this, why, clinical judgment is so important. And like I said, like with the protocol is a framework, right? On paper, protocols look very structured. And no matter how well designed they are, a protocol can't anticipate every clinical scenario that's going to come up, right? Every real world scenario. And I think for, especially in oncology, we're dealing with sick patients. These aren't healthy volunteers. These are patients that are heavily pre-treated. So even though your protocol is, perfectly structured, incredibly, written, it's not going to anticipate every single situation because these patients, again, have had multiple prior lines of therapy. They may have compromised bone marrow reserve, or they may have, their liver or kidney function may be borderline. And so and once they receive the investigational therapy, stuff starts happening. They'll have side effects, elevated lab enzymes. So on paper, everything looks straightforward, but then when you really look at the patient, you have to think about, their history. For example, let's go back to our previous example of, let's say their liver enzymes are increased, right? Now you're looking at the patient. Well, you have to really look at, is this due to their extensive liver mets that they've had when they joined the study? Is this due to the disease that's progressing? Did they start a recent, con medication that's affecting their liver enzymes? Or was there a baseline liver test abnormal already? So I think what happens is that you're really, you have to use clinical judgment and really start looking at the patient story from the beginning. And and for example, another thing is that a protocol may talk about a DLT period, right? And that's usually within the first initial days. But you can't rely on just the DLT period because AEs will happen after the DLT period. So you have to make sure that you're looking at an adverse event after the DLT period and still considering if it's related to the drug or not, because a lot of these DLT, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, a lot of these DLT definitions or rules that we have, they determine what the outcome of that dose escalation strategy would be. So I think you have to really make sure that when you're looking at what's occurring in a clinical trial, for these patients, you have to look at the patient data. You have to look at the patient history, their story, and kind of understand what's going on as the data is coming in and thinking about, is this a patient level issue or is this a study level issue? Is this occurring somewhere else? So I think we still need clinical judgment for these kind of events, especially where situations where the protocol can't anticipate everything. And this is important in early phase, first in human trials, especially oncology trials.
Yeah, yeah. And again, going back, it's the structure is there, but you
Mhm.
need patient's history and all the background they bring to fill those gaps. And this is an idea that it's been resonating with me since you started talking, and it's kind of like good science doesn't always lead to a successful trial. There's much more in there. And we tend to assume that if the underlying science is strong, the trial will succeed, right?
Yeah.
And I guess from what you've been saying, this assumption is wrong. So, what are some of the less obvious factors that can cause a scientifically promising trial to struggle or fail?
Yeah, and I think, we get this or we see this a lot in clinical development, and it's one of the most important topics, I believe, in clinical development. We spend a lot of time studying the science behind the new treatment. We're asking whether the treatment has the right target or whether the approach makes sense, and whether the early data is strong. But that's only a starting point. I think what really is important is the execution. It has to be designed and managed well to give that science a fair chance. You could have a promising treatment, but a poorly designed protocol, or you could have the right biomarker, but an unreliable assay or test. And another one that I face so many times is you can choose excellent study sites, but if the sites don't understand the trials consistently, if they don't address AEs or grade AEs consistently, you're going to have so many operational problems down the road. And I think another factor is delays in medical decision making, which can also cause serious problems. Let's say a site sends a over a patient eligibility question, right? And if there's a delay in getting an answer to the site, that's going to cause enrollment issues because obviously patients aren't going to be able to enroll on time, patient safety, site confidence, and trial timelines. So I think that's another important item that you have to focus on. And then also clear communication, I think is so important, and it's also very underestimated. Clinical trials involve so many different types of groups. We're dealing with investigators, sponsors, safety teams, vendors, and so forth. And even a scientifically strong program that has good science behind it can struggle if these groups aren't communicating well. And what I've learned over the years is that clinical trials is such a teamwork industry, and a role that you have to play, that you have to work together with other functional groups, and you have to be able to communicate with them efficiently, so the clinical trial runs, efficiently as well. So I think good science is important. Like I said, it's a good starting point, but that execution, that operational aspect has to be just as strong, because that's part of that science. They can't be separated. I think they go hand in hand and they're both important. So I think those are, other factors that people need to think about as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is another perspective, but not new to us, because we see the same patterns on our end. We work on the language business. We translate documents for sites, for example, and for patients. And some of the impacts we are seeing are pretty much the same: delays, understanding, training of the physicians and medical health providers, and struggling with those protocols, or even patients who need to understand what they are going through and what will happen next. So those physicians need to speak to them in a language they can understand, not just their mother tongue,
Yeah,
but for them to understand those protocols and know what will come next, what they need to expect. Um,
exactly.
and well, looking ahead, I know we've been talking before we started recording about oncology and which direction it's going.
Yeah.
So from precision medicine and increasingly targeted therapies to cell and gene therapies, what do you think will change about the way we develop cancer drugs over the next years? Maybe 5 years or 10 years. Everything is moving so fast.
Yeah.
What do you think the industry still needs to get better at?
So I think, like you said, cancer treatment is moving away from focusing on where that cancer started, right? And now we're focusing more on that biology of each patient's cancer. So, looking at two people with, let's say they both have lung cancer, their cancers can be so different at the biological level. And so because of this, they may need different treatments. I think in the future, we'll be looking at more using more precise biomarkers, blood tests to track changes in tumors, better diagnostic tools, and improve ways to understand why the cancer stops responding to treatment, resistant mechanisms, resistant pathways. So I think that's one of the things that we'll be seeing a lot. I think we'll also be really seeing many different types of treatments, like targeted therapies, antibody-based treatments, radiation, medication, cell and gene therapies, really moving into the early development phase. Right now, we're seeing cell and gene therapies, which are very interesting because they really require us to think about clinical trials differently, right? These treatments have unique risks. They have complicated manufacturing needs and long-term safety concerns. But now these therapies are also being studied outside of cancer. We're seeing them more and more in autoimmune disease and other long-term diseases. So I think this also changes our mindset because now we're looking at the benefit risk ratio differently for these patients. So when you look at cell and gene therapies in advanced cancer, these patients are willing to accept that serious side effects because they have few treatment options available. But when you now look at younger patients with a long-term autoimmune disease that can live for many years, that same risk can be different now. So treatment can look different. Treatment can work in the same way, but that outcome, that situation can look different for these patients. So I think so as these therapies are getting outside of oncology, we really have to change the way how we administer these therapies and how we operationally handle them because we can't just take the oncology model that we have for cell and gene therapies and just kind of use them for autoimmune diseases. I don't think that's going to work. And you really have to think about what's going to work in these autoimmune diseases or these other long-term diseases. I think now treatments are becoming more precise. So finding these patients are becoming harder. So we need to find ways to kind of keep up with that enrollment as well. And with that comes, really focusing on biomarker testing, site selection, enrollment planning, planning those ahead before the first patient in. Um, and so, innovation is increasing. It's moving so fast, but we need our systems, our teams to actually keep up with the scientific progress. So I think it's not only about creating smarter treatments, but it's also about building smarter systems to develop and deliver these treatments, to have the operational support that we need for these treatments. But there's a lot of exciting stuff that's going to happen and or is happening already in clinical trials. So I'm just really looking forward to it, and I think that's just very exciting to see what's happening in the next decade.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Everything is changing so fast. That yeah, it's exciting. Very
Yeah.
exciting. And my gosh, I could spend hours talking to you and learning from you. This has been an amazing session
Oh, thank
that needs,
you.
unfortunately, needs to come to an end. But before we go, is there anything that you'd like to share with our audience? Any additional information, recommendations?
Oh yeah, yeah. So I know, like what we talked about earlier, this industry, this pathway for physicians isn't really talked about, and you don't really hear about it until you meet someone or you talk to someone. And I just want to tell someone that if you're thinking about moving from clinical practice to industry. And I hear this a lot that a lot of people think that you're leaving medicine, right? But I don't necessarily think it's you're leaving medicine. You're just practicing medicine in a different way. Again, it all comes back to this. Instead of making decisions for one patient at a time, you're making decisions that will eventually affect thousands of patients in the future. And I think what it means is if you want to transition from clinical practice to industry, you really need to learn about clinical trials, regulations, safety, protocols, and how drug development works. And also working with a team, like I said, this is a very collaborative industry. So you need to be able to work as a team. And I think, yeah, just talk to people, get mentorship early on, and, connect with others. And I'm happy to connect with people on LinkedIn as well. So feel free to connect with me. I'm happy to talk about routes, mentorship, and drug development. So I think that's pretty much what I want to tell the audience.
Absolutely. Collaboration is key, and I'm sure our audience will appreciate the opportunity to connect and keep learning from you. Thank you so, so much, Dr. Padam, for your insight today. And to our audience, this Life Sciences in Focus podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other leading platforms, as well as on YouTube. Is if you prefer to watch us, so please make sure to tune again for next month. Vistatec Life Sciences in Focus, fascinating conversations with global life sciences experts. Bye.
Thank you.